November 23rd, 1987, Holland, Michigan. A chilling silence hung over Ransom Street that morning. Inside a newly renovated farmhouse, two young lives had been brutally taken. Rick and Gail Brink, a hard-working couple with dreams of a quiet future, were found murdered in what seemed like a perfect crime. No weapon, no witnesses, no answers. For nearly 3 decades, their deaths haunted Ottawa County like a ghost that refused to rest. Before we dive into this shocking case, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Crime Unknown, and comment where you're watching from, because this story travels far beyond the borders of Michigan. November 23rd, 1987. A heavy, unnatural silence hung over the newly renovated home on Ransom Street in Holland, Michigan. Rick Brink, a dependable 28-year-old craftsman and supervisor at a local furniture plant, had failed to show up for work that Monday morning. It was completely unlike him. His boss, Jim Carlson, felt a knot of worry tightening in his stomach. After getting no answer from Rick's home phone, Jim called Rick's parents, Garrett and Ida Brink. They hadn't heard from Rick or his 22-year-old wife Gail all weekend. Something was very wrong. Garrett and Ida rushed to their son's property, Jim close behind, dread mounting with every mile. When they arrived, a flicker of hope cut through their fear. Rick's Chevy Blazer sat in the driveway. Maybe the young couple had simply overslept or fallen ill, but that hope died the moment they drew closer. Through the Blazer's window, they could see Rick slumped over the driver's seat, knees on the floorboard, his head resting against the door. A dark red stain trailed down the glass. Rick wasn't moving. Garrett and Ida froze in horror. They backed away and dialed 911, hearts pounding. Deputies from the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department arrived and carefully entered the quiet house. In the master bedroom, they found a scene from a nightmare. Gail Brink lay lifeless on the bed, a pillow covering her face, a grotesque final courtesy from her killer. Beneath it were 3 point-blank gunshot wounds to her head. Just hours before, this young couple had been full of life and promise. Now, they had been brutally executed in their own home. At first, investigators considered the tragic possibility of a murder-suicide. Could Rick have shot his wife in a sudden rage and then turned the gun on himself? It wasn't uncommon for domestic violence to end that way. But that theory collapsed almost immediately. The presumed murder weapon, a .22 caliber handgun, was nowhere to be found. And Rick's wounds didn't align with a self-inflicted shot. He had been shot twice in the left side of his head while sitting in his vehicle. The Blazer's passenger window was pierced with a bullet hole, and the driver's side window had been partially rolled down. It looked as if Rick had rolled down his window to speak with someone he knew, someone he didn't fear, and that person shot him in cold blood. The absence of the gun meant someone else had been there, someone who walked away and took the evidence with them. This was no murder-suicide. It was a double homicide committed by an unknown intruder. And that person had been careful. Terrifyingly careful. The crime scene was eerily clean and quiet. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, no obvious struggle or ransacking. Valuables were left untouched. Cash sat in plain view on the kitchen counter beside Rick and Gail's wallets. Gail's jewelry and 2 watches lay undisturbed on the dresser. Both victims still wore their wedding rings. The only thing even slightly out of place was a small pile of clothes on the bedroom floor, as if Gail had begun to get ready for bed and set them aside. No shell casings were found at the scene, suggesting the killer either used a revolver that doesn't eject spent shells or meticulously picked up any evidence before leaving. The only bullets recovered were the ones lodged in the victims' bodies. Investigators dusted for fingerprints and managed to lift 6. 4 prints belonged to Rick and Gail. 2 were unknown, a partial print on a telephone and another on the toilet. Neither matched to anyone in the police database at the time. Whoever the killer was, they had left almost nothing behind. It was as close to a perfect crime scene as the Sheriff's Department had ever seen. For 27 years, the murders of Gail and Rick Brink would haunt Ottawa County. 2 young lives extinguished too soon, 2 families tormented by questions that went unanswered. Detectives had little physical evidence and no immediate suspects. That Monday in 1987 marked the beginning of a decades-long nightmare for the Holland community and for the Brink and Wingarden families. Wingarden was Gail's maiden name. Before we continue this shocking story, take a moment to subscribe to Crime Unknown and hit the like button on this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and it ensures you won't miss any future uploads. The Brink's deaths were not just an isolated tragedy. They became the first domino to fall in a saga of secrets and lies that spanned decades in this small Michigan community. In 2013, a newly formed cold case unit finally identified a suspect in the double homicide. Shockingly, it wasn't a stranger or a drifter as many had assumed. It turned out to be someone Gail knew and loved. It was someone who should have protected her, someone in her own family who had twisted love into a monstrous obsession. This case would ultimately showcase the persistence of families who refused to give up hope, the determination of detectives who wouldn't let old files gather dust, and the power of modern investigative techniques to give voice to victims long silenced. The truth, when it finally emerged, shook the community to its core. Holland, Michigan, a serene town nestled by the shores of Lake Michigan, lost its innocence after the Brink murders. Fear swept through Ottawa County like an icy wind off the lake. Neighbors who once greeted each other with friendly waves began to cast suspicious glances. Many started locking their doors at night for the first time. The dark underbelly of small-town life, the possibility that evil could be hiding in plain sight, had been exposed, and it would all crack wide open when the truth came out 27 years later. Perhaps the most haunting fact was that the key suspect had been there all along. He'd even been interviewed during the original investigation, only to slip through the cracks for decades. He stood at candlelight vigils with the grieving community, looked Gail's parents in the eye and feigned innocence, all while hiding unimaginable secrets behind a mask of normalcy. Quick check-in. Where are you watching from today? Let me know your location in the comments below. I'm always amazed at how far these stories reach and how they connect us across distances. Today on Crime Unknown, we will walk step by step through the events of that fateful November in 1987. We'll trace the decades of dead ends and unanswered questions that followed, and reveal the investigative breakthrough that finally brought a twisted form of justice to Gail and Rick Brink. This is a story of love and loss, of persistence and deception, and ultimately of justice delayed but not denied. A picture-perfect couple in a trusting community. In 1987, Ottawa County, Michigan felt like the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. Holland and its surrounding towns were communities built on trust and family values. People often left their doors unlocked. Kids rode their bikes freely in the streets until dusk without much worry. Violent crime was rare, and folks genuinely believed they lived in a safe corner of the world. Gail Ann Wingarden grew up in this environment. Born in 1965, Gail was part of a big, loving family. The Wingarden household was bustling and boisterous, 8 children in all, filled with laughter, sibling squabbles, and the kind of close-knit bonds money can't buy. There wasn't a lot of extra money to go around, but there was plenty of love. Gail, however, was determined to build something more for herself. Even as a girl, she told her older sister Cheryl that she had big plans for her future, and she was willing to work hard to achieve them. Gail was a naturally bright and ambitious young woman. As a teenager, she waitressed at a local restaurant, charming customers with her easy smile and quick wit. Regulars would ask for her section. Her cheerful personality and hard-working attitude often earned her hefty tips. She had a magnetic presence that lit up any room. Friends described her as someone whose laugh was infectious and whose positive energy drew people in. Gail was also undeniably beautiful, which drew a lot of attention, some of it welcome, some not. Fortunately, she had protective older siblings who kept a close eye on her. Her brother Ryan Wingarden, about 2.5 years older, was especially watchful, as was Cheryl. The two acted like a personal security detail whenever Gail was around, a big brother and big sister ready to ward off any unwanted suitors or trouble that might come her way. But trouble did come, and it came from someone Gail had once trusted. In the early 1980s, as a young adult, Gail fell into a whirlwind romance with a man named Lar. The relationship was intense and moved quickly, too quickly. Gail and Lar even started planning a future together, going so far as to begin building a house. But the foundations of that relationship were shaky. Beneath the passion were jealousy and control. Their intense fling soon turned toxic. Eventually, things spiraled into violence. During one awful confrontation, when Gail went to collect some of her belongings after a breakup, Lar slammed her hand in a drawer. In another incident, he struck her, leaving her with a black eye. It was a horrifying wake-up call. That black eye was the final straw, undeniable proof that this relationship was not just bad, but dangerous. Word of the abuse got back to Gail's family. Her protective older brother Ryan was furious. Ryan reportedly sought Lar out and delivered a stern physical warning, "Don't you ever lay a hand on my sister again." The message was received. Gail ended the relationship for good and walked away, shaken but relieved to be done with Lar. She was ready for a fresh start. It didn't take long for love to find Gail again, this time in a much healthier form. In 1984, Gail was 19 and working at an office job at an automotive dealership when a customer named Rick Brink walked in and caught her eye. Rick was 25, a skilled carpenter by trade, and known for being steady, reliable, and kind-hearted. That day, sparks flew almost immediately. Rick left the office absolutely smitten. In fact, he went straight home and told his mother, "I just met the woman I'm going to marry." Gail felt the connection too. After the chaos and pain of her last relationship, Rick was a breath of fresh air, solid, supportive, and genuine. He treated her with respect and warmth from day one. They shared the same goals and values. Both were no strangers to hard work. Both cherished the idea of building a loving family, and both dreamed of owning a cozy home where they could grow old together. Gail and Rick quickly became inseparable. To anyone who saw them together, they seemed like the perfect fit. Friends would later say that watching Gail and Rick together was like seeing two puzzle pieces click. Everything just made sense. That summer, Rick introduced Gail to one of his favorite hobbies, boating on Lake Michigan. Out on the sparkling water under the sunny sky, he taught her how to water ski. Gail's laughter echoed across the lake as she struggled, then managed to stand up on the skis, Rick cheering her on. They spent those days smiling and splashing and dreaming about the future. In photographs from that time, they looked carefree and completely in love. The kind of couple that makes others a little envious. The kind that seems to have it all. On April 25, 1986, just one day after Gail's 21st birthday, she and Rick made good on Rick's prediction. They got married. It was a small church ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Gail was radiant in her white dress. Rick beamed with happiness. At the reception by the lake, they danced together as if no one else existed. They were young and optimistic, confident that their future was as bright as the spring sunshine that blessed their wedding day. After a joyful honeymoon, the newlyweds settled back in Holland, ready to turn their plans into reality. Rick's father, Garrett, helped them find the perfect starter home, a rundown foreclosed house on 20 acres of land just outside of town, on Ransom Street. It was far from perfect. Years of neglect had left the house in disrepair, but Rick saw nothing but potential. A talented craftsman who even trained other carpenters, Rick knew he could transform the dilapidated property into their dream home. The big property also appealed to them. 20 acres meant plenty of room for the family they hoped to raise. In October 1986, Rick and Gail moved into the fixer-upper and rolled up their sleeves. Renovation became their shared project and passion. They spent their evenings and weekends painting walls, tearing down old paneling, installing new fixtures, and making the space their own. Rick taught Gail how to use power tools. Gail taught Rick how to dance around a paintbrush in one hand and a radio in the other. The couple even recorded home videos of their progress, laughing and goofing around in dusty work clothes as they scrubbed and sanded. The house on Ransom Street was slowly coming back to life, just as they were building their own life within it. By November 1987, about 18 months into their marriage, the Brinks had finally finished most of the major renovations. The old house was now a warm, welcoming home, and it seemed that might not be the only project nearing completion. Gail had begun to share a little secret with her sister Cheryl. Once the house was completely done, their next renovation would be a nursery. It was a subtle way of saying that Gail and Rick were ready to start a family. They were standing on the threshold of everything they had ever wanted. The last night, Saturday, November 21st, 1987, was a day of celebration for the Brinks. One of Rick's high school friends was getting married, and the wedding reception was that evening at a local hall. Rick and Gail attended with joy in their hearts, dressed in their best. The party was lively and filled with music, clinking glasses, and the good kind of chaos that comes with weddings. Guests would later recall seeing Rick and Gail on the dance floor, glowing with happiness, dancing as if they were still newlyweds, which truly they were. Rick enjoyed a couple of beers. Gail was a little tipsy and giggly by the end of the night, basking in the fun. By around 11 p.m., the Brinks decided to call it a night. They said their goodbyes, congratulated the newlyweds one last time, and headed out to the parking lot. It was a chilly November night in Michigan. They climbed into their car, with Rick at the wheel and Gail beside him, and drove off toward their home on Ransom Street. The car's taillights disappeared into the darkness down a quiet road. Maybe on the drive they talked about the wedding, about how beautiful the bride looked, or which songs were the most fun to dance to. Maybe they discussed their own plans for the holidays or that future nursery project. We can only imagine their final conversation. In the stillness of the night, under a sky full of stars, Gail and Rick Brink headed home, utterly unaware that they had only a few hours left to live. An unnatural silence. Sunday, November 22, 1987, passed quietly and uneventfully for most people in Holland. But for Gail and Rick Brink's family and friends, small seeds of worry were beginning to sprout. Typically, the Brinks might check in or go to church or Sunday dinner, but calls to their phone went unanswered all day. Gail's brother Ryan dialed her number that Sunday and got nothing but ringing on the other end. No answer, no machine, just that endless tone. He tried more than once, but each attempt met the same empty result. Still, no one immediately panicked. It was a cold weekend. Perhaps the couple had decided to lay low, or maybe they had gone out of town spontaneously. By Monday morning, however, concern burst into full alarm. Rick Brink never missed work without calling ahead, and he certainly wouldn't abandon his job without notice, especially not at Trendway Corporation, the local furniture manufacturer where he worked as a supervisor and master craftsman. When Rick did not show up for his shift on Monday, November 23rd, and hadn't called in, red flags went up. Jim Carlson, Rick's boss, knew something had to be wrong. Jim first phoned Rick and Gail's house, but once again the calls rang on and on. Next, he reached out to Rick's parents. Garrett and Ida Brink immediately felt their own dread magnify. By now they too had been worried after not hearing from the couple since Saturday. The three of them agreed to meet and drive out to the Ransom Street house to check on Rick and Gail. The drive was tense and quiet. Garrett and Ida tried to reassure each other with half-spoken hopes. Maybe the car broke down, and they were out of town. Maybe they both caught the flu and were resting. But as they turned into the long driveway, the sight of Rick's Chevy Blazer parked outside eased their anxiety only for a moment. The vehicle was there, which meant Rick and Gail should be home. So why weren't they answering the phone? They got out of the car into the cold morning air. The house was still, no smoke from the chimney, no lights on. Garrett approached Rick's Blazer, calling his son's name. Through the glass, he could see someone inside. In an instant, that flicker of hope turned into a punch of terror. Rick was in the driver's seat, but he was slumped over unnaturally between the seats. Garrett yanked the door open and found his son unresponsive, blood staining the side of his head and the upholstery. Ida gasped and turned away, instinctively knowing the worst. Rick was dead, shot to death in his own truck. Garrett felt his world tilt and collapse. Despite the wave of panic and grief, he had the presence of mind to stop everyone from rushing into the house. If Rick had been violently attacked, Gail could be hurt, or the attacker might still be around. Jim Carlson ran to a neighbor's house and frantically called 911. Ottawa County Sheriff's deputies and detectives arrived swiftly and secured the property. Detective Mark Jelinski, a seasoned investigator with 15 years on the force, led the team that carefully entered the Brink home, guns drawn, braced for anything. The scene inside was disturbingly calm and orderly, nothing obviously ransacked or overturned. They moved through the rooms until they found the master bedroom. There, on the bed, lay what they feared, Gail Brink's body. She was on her back, tucked amid the blankets, as if peacefully asleep except for the pillow covering her face. One officer gently lifted the pillow, and the grim truth was revealed. Gail had been shot 3 times in the face at point-blank range. The pillow was soaked through with blood where it had muffled the fatal shots. The execution-style nature of the killing was obvious and chilling. Detectives noted that Gail was wearing a nightshirt. A small pile of folded clothes on the floor suggested she had changed for bed shortly before she was killed. It looked as if someone had surprised her while she was half asleep. With confirmation of 2 victims, the Brink home officially became a homicide crime scene. Investigators fanned out and began processing evidence, though at first glance there was little to find. The killer had left the scene shockingly pristine. There were no footprints in the fresh snow outside. If there had been any snowfall or dew that morning, it didn't show tracks. Possibly the ground was dry. Doors and windows showed no signs of forced entry. Whoever came in might have been let in or had easy access, perhaps even a key. Inside, nothing obvious was missing. The presence of cash and valuables in plain sight ruled out robbery as a motive. The brutality suggested something deeply personal or profoundly calculated. As the coroner arrived and the painstaking process of evidence gathering continued, detectives pieced together the likely events. The evidence indicated Rick was shot first, out in his vehicle, possibly as he was about to exit or had just pulled up to the house. The driver's side window was partially down. Rick may have recognized the person approaching and rolled it down to speak to them. That person then fired 2 .22 caliber bullets into the left side of Rick's head at close range, killing him. One bullet went through Rick's skull and exited, shattering the Blazer's passenger side window from the inside. The other lodged in his brain. Rick never had a chance to defend himself. He collapsed sideways toward the passenger seat, bleeding heavily. The killer then likely moved into the house. Gail, who had gone to bed, perhaps heard something, or maybe Rick's killer walked in so quietly that she was taken completely by surprise. The first shot to Gail's face might have been while she was asleep or just waking up. The killer then fired twice more into her face at point-blank range. Using the pillow to cover her face was a strange, almost compassionate gesture, in an act that was anything but compassionate. Perhaps the murderer couldn't stand to look at Gail's face after what they'd done, or they wanted to muffle the noise of the gunshots. Either way, it was a cold execution. Detectives recovered the bullets from the victims and the car, determining they were .22 caliber rounds. However, a thorough search failed to turn up the firearm that fired them. If this had been a domestic murder-suicide by Rick, the gun should have been at either the car or the bedside. It wasn't. That meant an outside killer had been present and had removed the weapon from the scene. The murder weapon was presumed to be a .22 caliber handgun, likely a revolver, since no shell casings were found. This one detail completely shifted the investigation. What at first glance looked like it could have been an inside job, a husband killing his wife and then himself, was now clearly a double murder by an unknown assailant. Word of the tragedy spread quickly through Holland and the surrounding areas. By Monday afternoon, local news headlines were blaring the shocking news of the young couple's murder. Such violence was virtually unheard of in their community, and people were terrified. This wasn't Detroit or some big city, after all. This was a peaceful town where big crimes just didn't happen, certainly not to people like Rick and Gail. Residents struggled to make sense of it. As investigators worked the scene, sheriff's deputies also began canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something over the weekend. But Ransom Street was semi-rural, properties were spaced apart, and late Saturday night into Sunday morning was a time when most were asleep. No obvious witnesses had come forward yet. Back at the station, the sheriff's department assembled a task force to handle the double homicide. They combed through Rick and Gail's backgrounds, looking for any red flag that might point to an enemy or someone with a vendetta. Was there anyone who might want to hurt them? Initially, everyone who knew the Brinks had the same answer: no. Rick and Gail were well-liked, hard-working, drama-free. They had no known involvement with drugs, crime, or anything that would invite such an attack. To the outside observer, they were a picture-perfect couple with no enemies. Detectives refused to believe that, though. Everyone has some conflict in their lives, some secrets or strains in their relationships. And so they started by talking in depth with family and close friends, hoping to find any fissure in the Brinks' happy facade. Early leads: jealousy or mistaken identity. One of the first people investigators interviewed was Gail's older sister, Cheryl Wingarden, now Cheryl Murphy after marriage. Cheryl was devastated by the loss of her beloved sister, but she was also forthcoming with information. In the haze of her grief, Cheryl remembered a potential threat from Gail's past, the abusive ex-boyfriend La. She recounted to police how badly that relationship had ended. She described Gail's injuries back then, the smashed hand, the black eye, and how violently possessive La had been. Cheryl and her brother Ryan had worried that La might not let Gail go so easily. Could he have come back to retaliate, or out of twisted jealousy after Gail moved on and found happiness with Rick? It was a plausible theory. Perhaps La harbored a grudge over Gail breaking up with him, and seeing her thriving with a new husband could have enraged him to the point of murder. Investigators thought the jealous ex-boyfriend angle was a solid lead. A lover's quarrel turning deadly is a common storyline in violent crimes. Detectives quickly tracked down La, whose full name was Larry. We'll call him La, as Gail did. They found him and brought him in for questioning. To their surprise, La was cooperative. He admitted he'd been angry and bitter about the breakup with Gail, but he flatly denied having anything to do with the murders. He claimed he had been nowhere near Holland the weekend Rick and Gail were killed. Detectives noticed that La seemed genuinely shaken by the news of Gail's death. Of course, that could have been an act, but they had to check out his alibi. La provided details of where he was that weekend, and investigators followed up. They also subjected him to a polygraph test, common practice at the time for lack of better technology. La passed the polygraph, and his alibi checked out through witness statements. He had a solid story that placed him away from the crime. There was no evidence tying him to the murder scene at all. Reluctantly, investigators crossed the jealous ex off their suspect list. The first promising lead had evaporated, and they were back to square one. The double murder of Rick and Gail Brink dominated local headlines and the nightly news. As days passed with no arrest, the community's shock turned into palpable fear. If not a jilted ex-lover, who could have done this? The idea of a random killer in their midst began to take hold, an even more frightening prospect. Local newspapers like the Holland Sentinel ran daily stories on the case. Frank Miller, the Sentinel's editor, noted that the town's mood had changed drastically overnight. "People here are used to quiet lives," he told a reporter. "Now every rumor feels like a threat. This case has changed how everyone sees their neighbor." Normally in Holland, gossip might revolve around high school sports or church events. Now the whispers on every street were about the murders. Folks traded theories at the grocery store and after Sunday services. Parents grew anxious, keeping their kids closer to home. The once trustful atmosphere gave way to suspicion. Hardware stores even reported an uptick in sales of deadbolt locks and outdoor lights. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up in subdivisions that had never considered needing them. A collective question loomed. Was the killer one of us? About a week after the murders, a bizarre new lead emerged, one that would plunge the investigation into the shadowy underworld far beyond Holland's city limits. A man nicknamed Shotgun Sid walked into the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office with an alarming theory. Sid was a local character well known to law enforcement. He had a checkered past involving drugs and firearms and was rumored to have connections to outlaw motorcycle gangs in Detroit. In fact, Sid had once owned the very house on Ransom Street that Rick and Gail had renovated. He had lost it in a foreclosure, which was how the Brinks came to buy it. When Sid heard about the murders at his old address, he was convinced it wasn't a coincidence. According to Sid, the execution-style killings had the hallmarks of a gang hit. He suspected that he was the real target, that someone from his past, perhaps an enemy from his drug-dealing days or a rival biker, had come looking to settle a score. The hitmen, he theorized, must not have realized Sid didn't live there anymore and mistakenly killed the new homeowners, Rick and Gail, as collateral damage. It was a chilling scenario, a mistaken identity double murder carried out by cold-blooded criminals in search of Shotgun Sid. This lead, while far-fetched, could not be ignored. It introduced a completely different potential motive. The Brinks might have been random victims caught in someone else's crossfire. Investigators followed Sid's information into the dark alleys of the criminal world. They liaised with federal agencies, as Sid was a known informant himself by that point, and reached out to contacts in Detroit. Throughout late 1987 and into 1988, detectives investigated whether any motorcycle gang members or drug traffickers had been active in the Holland area, or if any chatter in the criminal underworld matched the Brinks case. Sid himself made some calls within his old networks, trying to sniff out if any contracts or hits had been put out on him that could align with the timing of the murders. For a while, this theory consumed a lot of time and resources. Officers interviewed anyone associated with Sid, even bringing in some of his former crew for questioning. They delved into the gritty details of Sid's past, looking for names of people who might seek revenge on him. Weeks turned into months, and the gang hit theory began to fizzle. Despite their deep dive, detectives found no concrete evidence that a biker gang or drug cartel was behind the murders. None of Sid's former associates had recent activity in Holland around that time, and no whisper of a hit on Sid ever surfaced. In fact, as Sid learned more from his contacts, even he started doubting his own hypothesis. It seemed that, as sensational as the idea was, Gail and Rick's murder likely had nothing to do with Sid's criminal past after all. Once again, investigators hit a dead end. By the end of 1987, the sense of panic in the community only worsened. Tragedy struck again on December 24, 1987, Christmas Eve, when a local woman named Deborah Wilson, age 30, was reported missing and later found murdered. Deborah's husband came home from a holiday party to an eerie scene. The lights in their house were all on, and a sliding glass door at the back was left wide open. Concerned, he and his father searched the area. In a snow-dusted field behind the house, they discovered Deborah's body. She had been savagely stabbed and her throat cut. The brutality of the crime and its timing, on Christmas Eve of all nights, shook Holland to its core. What made it even more alarming was the proximity and parallels to the Brink case. Deborah Wilson's home was in the same general area, less than half a mile from Rick and Gail's house. She was the same age as Rick and had even attended the same high school. 2 violent murders, 5 weeks apart, practically in the same neighborhood. It could hardly be a coincidence, people thought. Investigators could not ignore the similarities. Almost immediately, whispers of a serial killer began circulating. Was there some madman targeting young couples or women in this area? Detectives re-examined other unsolved cases in the vicinity, and one case in particular leapt out: the 1977 unsolved murder of Deborah Polinsky, a 20-year-old who had been stabbed to death in her bedroom a decade earlier. Deborah Polinsky's home was also within a mile of the Brink house. Suddenly they had 3 murders in the same small region: Gail Brink, shot in bed; Deborah Wilson, stabbed, presumably attacked at home; and Deborah Polinsky, stabbed at home. 2 of the victims even shared the name Deborah. The press had a field day with this, albeit cautiously. Nobody wanted to incite hysteria, but the pattern was hard to ignore. Was someone out there preying on women in Holland? People imagined a Jack the Ripper or some unnamed monster roaming their peaceful community. Parents kept their children on even tighter leashes. Nobody wanted to travel alone after dark. Gun sales reportedly increased as households armed themselves for protection. Holland, Michigan, was a far cry from the big city, but now it felt like a place under siege by an unknown evil. Despite the eerie coincidences, police could not find any tangible evidence linking the Brink murders with those of Deborah Wilson or Deborah Polinsky. The modus operandi differed. The Brinks were killed with a firearm, execution style, while the 2 Deborahs were viciously stabbed. The investigators had to consider the possibility that it was all a tragic alignment of separate events. Indeed, it turned out that Deborah Wilson's murder was a separate case. Eventually, years later, a suspect in that case emerged, and after his death, reportedly a confession or evidence closed it. Deborah Polinsky's killer too would be identified decades later as someone she knew. There was no serial killer on the loose tying these crimes together. But in early 1988, with no answers, the law enforcement couldn't conclusively say one way or another. They had to pursue all angles, and for a time the Brink case file was placed alongside the Wilson and Polinsky cases as part of a broader review of unsolved local homicides. As winter turned to spring and then summer of 1988, the Brink investigation stalled. Every promising path had led to a dead end. No fingerprints, no DNA. DNA profiling was in its infancy in the late 80s. No eyewitnesses. The community's frenzy gradually gave way to resignation. People still remembered and grieved, of course. Gail and Rick's families certainly did, but the headlines slowly faded. The sheriff's department had other cases and limited resources. The Brink file was eventually placed among the growing stack of cold cases. It was an outcome that, at the time, felt like defeat. For the Brink and Wingarden families, unsolved was an unbearable verdict. Garrett and Ida Brink had lost their only son. The Wingarden siblings had lost their beloved Gail. Both families, joined by marriage, leaned on each other in grief, but the lack of justice was a constant ache. They met regularly with Ottawa County Sheriff Thomas Riley, who was determined yet frustrated. Sheriff Riley would assure them at each meeting that the department hadn't forgotten the case, that they would keep looking whenever new information emerged. But as months turned into years, those conversations became more difficult. By the early 1990s, most of the original investigators had either retired or moved on. Memories faded, evidence boxes gathered dust. Gail's sister Cheryl remained a vocal advocate for her little sister. She organized small memorials on anniversaries of the murder, keeping Gail and Rick's story alive in the community's memory. Cheryl and other family members gave interviews to any journalist willing to revisit the story. They refused to let the case truly die. Still, without new evidence or breakthroughs, hope was hard to hold on to. The cold case reawakens. By 2009, more than 20 years had passed since the murders. Ottawa County had grown and changed, but it still remembered the Brink case as one of its most haunting unsolved mysteries. That year, the Sheriff's Department launched a cold case unit, a two-person team dedicated to re-examining old, unsolved crimes. Advances in forensic technology, especially DNA analysis, had sparked renewed interest in clearing cold cases nationwide, and Ottawa County didn't want their cases left behind. Two veteran detectives were assigned, David Blakely and Venus Repper. They were outsiders, in a sense, having spent much of their careers downstate, so they came to these old files with fresh eyes and no personal biases or loyalties in the community. Detective Repper later explained one advantage of time passing. Loyalties change, friendships change. People who kept secrets back then might not feel the need to keep them anymore, or they've held it so long they're just waiting for someone to ask so they can unburden themselves. Blakely and Repper started with the unsolved murders of Deborah Wilson, 1987, and Deborah Polinsky, 1977, given the speculation of a link. They meticulously reviewed the case files, interviewed old witnesses, and employed new forensic tests on whatever evidence had been preserved. Their hard work paid off. Eventually, these two cases saw resolution. In the case of Deborah Wilson, a suspect, who had long been under a cloud of suspicion, had since died, and apparently before his death he confessed to an acquaintance. This, combined with some supporting evidence, allowed the police to close the case. For Deborah Polinsky's 1977 murder, an old acquaintance of hers eventually confessed out of guilt, finally giving her family some closure after nearly 30 years. With those cases resolved, the cold case detectives turned their full attention to the big one, the murders of Gail and Rick Brink. By 2011, Detective David Blakely and Detective Venus Repper began the slow, methodical process of resurrecting the Brink case. They pulled every box of evidence, every transcript, every forgotten tip from storage. Some documents were so old and handled that they were falling apart. Pages had to be delicately taped back together. The detectives read thousands of pages of reports and notes. They created timelines, lists of persons of interest, and family trees. They re-interviewed Rick and Gail's friends and family members, hoping that over 2 decades later, someone might recall a tiny detail or feel safe to share something they hadn't before. More than 200 interviews were conducted in this reinvestigation. They even crossed state lines to track down people who had moved away in the intervening years. It was exhaustive work, but Blakely and Repper were tenacious. Early on, one name that inevitably resurfaced was Ryan Wingarden, Gail's own brother. Back in 1987, Ryan had been one of many family members interviewed in the initial investigation, and nothing about that interview had particularly stood out at the time. Ryan, then 24, had given a statement and an alibi, and that was it. But as the cold case team looked at the old files with 2011 eyes, something caught their attention. Buried deep in the records was a summary of a polygraph test taken by Ryan's then-girlfriend, now wife, Pamela. In that report, one detail practically jumped off the page. Pamela had failed part of her polygraph back in the late 80s when asked if she was with Ryan the entire night of the murders. Specifically, at one point she admitted she had not been with Ryan through the whole night of November 21, 1987, contradicting what she and Ryan initially told police. This was huge. It appeared that Pam had once wavered on their story, but somehow this discrepancy had been overlooked or not pursued vigorously by the original investigators. Ryan Wingarden's alibi might have a crack in it. To Blakely and Repper, that old polygraph note was like a neon sign. If Ryan's alibi was shaky, and if multiple people had quietly mentioned over the years that some of Ryan's behavior after the murders was odd, indeed the cold case detectives had gathered some second-hand stories, more on those soon, then he deserved a much closer look. So the detectives arranged to interview Ryan and Pam in 2011. By now, Ryan Wingarden was a 48-year-old man. He had married Pam, her maiden name was Pamela Marachini, back in 1988, not long after the murders, and they were still together over 2 decades later with a family of their own. Ryan was essentially a stay-at-home dad. Pam worked to support the family. They lived in a neighboring community and had built a life that by outward appearances seemed normal enough. When investigators reached out about revisiting the Brink case, Ryan and Pam agreed to come in and talk. Perhaps they believed that after so long their old story would hold, or that nothing new could possibly be discovered. Notably, when they arrived at the sheriff's office, Ryan was extremely anxious and controlling. He insisted on staying right by Pam's side the entire time. In fact, when Detective Repper prepared to interview Pam separately, Ryan objected and asked to sit in on his wife's interview. That was an immediate red flag. Typically, innocent parties don't mind being questioned separately, and often husband-wife pairs aren't even in the same room for police interviews to avoid influencing each other's memories. The detectives flatly denied Ryan's request. Pam would be interviewed alone. Left in the lobby, Ryan stewed while Detective Blakely and Detective Repper gently questioned Pam. Pam's demeanor was a stark contrast to her husband's. She was quiet, even meek, with a nervous energy. She stuck to the exact story that she and Ryan had given in 1987. On the night of Saturday, November 21st, 1987, Ryan and Pam, who had only been dating a short time then, said they went to do laundry at a friend's house because their apartment dryer wasn't working. According to Pam, they spent the evening washing clothes at this friend's place, a woman named Rose, if the original statements were accurate, and then returned home late, went to bed, and slept through the night. The next morning, Sunday, they said they woke up and went about a normal day, only later hearing about Gail and Rick's deaths. Pam repeated this account calmly, as if reciting a well-practiced script. When asked if Ryan was with her the whole time that Saturday night, she answered yes, without hesitation. There was no hint of the admission noted in the old file that she'd once said otherwise. It seemed clear to the detectives that Pam was still covering for Ryan, if indeed there was more to cover. The interview yielded nothing substantially new. After a few hours, Ryan and Pam left the station together. Repper and Blakely were left somewhat frustrated. They had hoped Pam might open up after so long, or that Ryan's nerves would crack. Instead, they'd encountered a couple who, on the surface, seemed cooperative and stuck to their story. But the detectives' instincts told them something was off. They noticed subtle signs, Pam's eyes darting to the floor, the tone of someone who's been coached. Ryan's overbearing presence, the way Pam seemed relieved when the interview concluded, as if she'd narrowly escaped disaster. The cold case team decided that if Pam wouldn't or couldn't talk yet, they'd need another way to pry this case open. Digging further into Ryan Wingarden's history around 1987, the detectives discovered a crucial piece of context. At the time of the murders, Ryan had not one but two girlfriends. He was dating Pam, the new girlfriend, but he was also still involved with a previous long-term girlfriend named Chris Bann. Chris had been with Ryan for quite a while before Pam came into the picture, but their relationship ended around the time Ryan started getting serious with Pam. Interestingly, Ryan and Chris had parted on fairly good terms and even remained friends afterwards. The cold case detectives thought Chris might have insights into Ryan's behavior after the murders, especially since she knew him during that exact period and wasn't under his influence anymore. They found Chris and sat down to interview her. At first, Chris didn't have much to add beyond the obvious. She knew Gail was Ryan's sister. She recalled how shocking the murders were, and she knew that Ryan and Pam had given an alibi about doing laundry that night. Chris herself hadn't been with Ryan that weekend. He was with Pam, presumably, so she had no first-hand knowledge of his activities at the time of the crime. As the interview wrapped up, Detectives Blakely and Repper felt a bit deflated, yet another conversation yielding nothing new. They began to pack up their notes, thanking Chris for her time, when she paused. "Well, actually," she said, seemingly thinking twice about something, "there might be something else." The detectives' ears perked up and they sat back down, pens at the ready. What Chris told them next changed everything. In the week following the murders back in November 1987, Ryan had asked Chris to go for a drive with him. They ended up at a local park, sitting in the car. Ryan was clearly on edge. He told Chris he wanted to drive by the crime scene, by Gail and Rick's house, because the whole thing was bothering him. Chris immediately refused. The idea of going near that house where such terrible violence occurred gave her the creeps. The heebie-jeebies, she said. Instead, they stayed parked at the park, and that's when Ryan unburdened himself with a sickening confession. Ryan told Chris that he and his sister Gail had a sexual relationship when they were younger. According to Ryan's account, it began when Gail was around 9 years old, and he was about 12, and continued into their early teens. Incredibly, Ryan tried to frame it as consensual, as if they were two curious kids exploring. Chris recalled him explicitly describing it like they were playing doctor or playing nurse. He claimed it was mutual, until one time when they were teenagers, Gail around 14, Ryan 17 or so, presumably, Gail tried to put a stop to it, and he forced himself on her one last time. In blunt terms, Ryan admitted that when Gail said no, he raped his sister. Detectives Blakely and Repper listened to this in stunned silence. They had heard of no such thing before. Gail's tragic story, as known publicly, had never included any hint of sexual abuse or incest, and here was a bombshell motive landing in their laps. If Ryan's twisted secret was true, it recast everything. Gail wasn't just his kid sister, she was his longtime victim, and when she grew up, moved on, and found happiness with Rick, that could have sparked a toxic mix of jealousy, resentment, and fear in Ryan. Fear that Gail might finally reveal the abuse to her new husband, perhaps. Jealousy that another man now had Gail's love and attention. A sense of power slipping away after years of holding a sick power over her. It was a motive more disturbing than any they'd considered. Ryan Wingarden might have murdered his sister to silence her and to punish her for escaping his control. Chris's revelations didn't end there. She also recounted how during that same conversation, Ryan showed her a photograph he had from a recent boat outing. It was a picture of Gail in a bikini, taken during that summer of 1987 when Rick had taught Gail to water ski. Ryan ogled his own sister in the photo, telling Chris, "Look how hot she is." He admitted to Chris that during that boat trip, he couldn't stop staring lustfully at Gail in her swimsuit, and that Rick had noticed his creepy staring. Chris described Ryan's demeanor as she realized the extent of his obsession with Gail. It unsettled her deeply. This wasn't the normal protective big brother image Ryan had always tried to show. This was something deviant and alarming. Armed with this new information, detectives Blakely and Repper finally saw the outline of the truth. Ryan Wingarden, the supposedly protective brother, was in fact a predator who had been abusing Gail since childhood. When Gail got married and built a life separate from him, he lost control over her. Perhaps there were family tensions, like the money and property arguments they'd heard about, that sparked anger. But underlying it all was a twisted, incestuous jealousy, and the ultimate fear that Gail might tell Rick about the abuse, which could shatter the family and land Ryan in prison, or at least in disgrace. The motive was there: sex, shame, jealousy. It was powerful, but motive isn't enough to convict someone of murder. They needed evidence. Chris's testimony was important, but it was second-hand confession and context. It alone wouldn't be enough to charge Ryan with a double homicide. The detectives needed more direct information, ideally from someone who was actually with Ryan around the time of the murders. That meant they needed Pamela to talk. The cold case team started discreetly gathering more background from Ryan and Gail's family members, hoping to corroborate anything Chris had revealed and to uncover any other strange behavior by Ryan that might have been dismissed or overlooked back in 1987. What they found was a trove of unsettling anecdotes. Cheryl, Gail's older sister, had been estranged from Ryan for years due to a family dispute over their late father's veterans' benefits. Yet after Ryan's interview with the cold case team in 2011, out of the blue he called Cheryl, attempting to reconcile. He told her, "Life's too short. Blood is thicker than water," and suggested they let bygones be bygones. To Cheryl, this was bizarre. Ryan had shown no inclination to mend fences for ages, and suddenly he was playing the role of peacemaker. The timing, right after police started sniffing around again, struck Cheryl as far from coincidental. It felt to her like Ryan was shoring up alibis and goodwill just in case. When the detectives carefully informed Cheryl about the incestuous abuse revelation, they had to break the horrific news that her siblings' relationship was far from what she thought. Cheryl was floored. She was physically ill at the thought, trying to reconcile it with her memories. In hindsight, some moments took on a darker cast. She remembered how, at Gail and Rick's funeral in 1987, Ryan had acted extremely strangely. At one point he described to her a hypothetical blow-by-blow account of the murder scene, as if he were envisioning or remembering it in great detail. He spoke of someone walking down the hallway of the house, entering Gail's bedroom, seeing Gail in bed before shooting her, details that at that time weren't fully public. Cheryl had found it odd, but assumed he was just haunted by imagining what happened. Then, chillingly, Ryan had said to her, "You know, sometimes I wonder if I could have done this." It was such a bizarre, shocking statement that Cheryl had essentially brushed it off as Ryan being in extreme grief or shock. Why on earth would her own brother even pose that question about himself? But now, hearing about the incest secret, that comment sounded like a red-handed admission, or at least a deeply troubled mind wrestling with guilt. Lynn, another sister of Gail and Ryan, told detectives that sometime after the murders, Ryan had expressed a disturbing sentiment to her as well. According to Lynn, Ryan confided that he wished he could apologize to Gail because he felt that he had raped her. Lynn, not knowing anything about an incestuous past at the time, found the comment utterly baffling and upsetting. What was he talking about? She eventually understood it as Ryan referring to a sexual assault on Gail, but without context, she didn't know if it was something that had actually happened or some twisted thought in his head. It was such a painful, confusing notion that she didn't share it widely back then. Now, decades later, with detectives pressing, she confirmed Ryan had indeed said that, more than once even. Lynn also mentioned Ryan had made similar comments to one of his own nieces, the daughter of one of their siblings. Apparently trying to unburden or excuse himself, he told the niece that he felt bad for what he had done to Gail when they were young. Aunt Neva, an aunt to the Wingarden siblings, had another disturbing recollection. On the very day of the murders, Saturday, November 21st, 1987, both Gail and Ryan had called Aunt Neva separately, venting about each other. Gail was upset because she had co-signed a car loan for Ryan and he owed her money, and he was behind on payments. She also told Neva she was frustrated with Ryan for other reasons. At the time, Ryan and Pam were living in an apartment complex where their parents, Garrett and Ida, were temporarily staying in an RV. The landlord had an issue with the RV being parked there, so Ryan wanted to move the parents' RV onto Gail and Rick's property on Ransom Street. Gail had refused, fearing liability issues and concerned because the house was still under construction inside. She didn't want her younger siblings or parents living on site just yet, for safety reasons. Ryan took great offense at this, feeling Gail was acting too good for the family now that she had land and a new home. Never said that Ryan was fuming during his call, saying that Gail thought she was better than them and wouldn't help their own parents. This argument, trivial as it might seem, parking an RV, repaying a loan, significantly raised tensions between Ryan and Gail just hours before the wedding reception and subsequent murders. Aunt Neva also described an encounter with Ryan at Gail's funeral that mirrored what he told Cheryl. Ryan, in a cold, matter-of-fact way, told Neva something along the lines of, "If Gail and Rick had let Mom and Dad park that camper on their land, they'd still be alive today." It was as if he squarely blamed Gail's decision for the murders, an extremely odd and callous thing to say at her funeral, basically implying a cause and effect that bordered on a confession. And then Ryan asked Neva directly, with an unsettling look in his eye, "Do you think I would be capable of doing something like this?" Neva remembered telling him, "Of course not. What a crazy thing to ask." But it disturbed her at the time and stuck in her memory. Investigators also found out about some macabre behavior of Ryan's in the aftermath of the killings. Not long after the funeral, Ryan had approached a family friend and rather casually offered to sell Gail's waterbed to them at a bargain price. Yes, the very bed on which his sister had been murdered. The friend recalled being so startled and appalled by the offer that they declined and ended the conversation quickly. It was as if the gravity of what happened in that bedroom didn't register for Ryan, or he perversely wanted to get rid of the evidence of it. Additionally, Ryan had rummaged through Gail's personal belongings shortly after her death. At one point, he found some old letters that other men had written to Gail, perhaps past admirers or friends, and he burned them. It was an inexplicable act of possessiveness and jealousy. Why would a brother do that? Taken together, these accounts painted a picture of Ryan Wingardin as a deeply disturbed individual who had a long history of obsessing over Gail and who exhibited a mix of guilt, possessiveness, and blame in the aftermath of her death. Importantly, though, all this evidence was circumstantial. It established motive and a pattern of behavior, but none of it was the smoking gun that directly tied him to the murders of Gail and Rick. The prosecution could build a case out of it, sure, but it would be tough without something more concrete or a direct witness. The cold case detectives knew their best chance at that something more lay with Pam Wingardin, the one person still alive who might have first-hand knowledge of Ryan's actions that night. They also knew that prying the full truth from Pam would be delicate. She had kept Ryan's dark secret for decades, likely out of fear, and perhaps also out of a kind of trauma bond loyalty. Over the years, Ryan had dominated Pam's life. He was controlling to the extreme. He reportedly insisted on homeschooling their children himself, keeping Pam and the kids isolated. He called Pam multiple times a day when she was at work to check in, and he kept tight control over her social interactions. By all accounts, Pam lived under Ryan's thumb. If they were going to get her to talk, they needed to make sure she felt safe and protected from Ryan's influence. In late 2012, Blakely and Repper brought Ryan and Pam back in for a second round of interviews. This time, they separated them from the outset. Ryan was confronted with some of the information they'd gathered. Not the incest yet, that they saved as a card up their sleeve, but inconsistencies, and the fact that their alibi from 1987 wasn't ironclad. Ryan grew aggressive and defensive. When asked point-blank if he had anything inappropriate going on with his sister back then, he played dumb. "What do you mean?" Detective Blakely stared at him. "You know exactly what I mean." There was a long, pregnant pause. Finally, Ryan mumbled, "We were just two kids exploring. It was like doctors and nurses." He downplayed it as a one-time silly childhood incident. The detectives weren't buying it, and his vague admission was revolting. Ryan refused to elaborate any further and ended the interview. It wasn't a confession to murder by any means, but it was the first time he'd admitted anything sexual had ever happened with Gail. That alone was a startling development. Something he had kept denied or hidden for so long had now slipped out under pressure. Meanwhile, in a separate room, Pam was interviewed again. For 3 hours, Detective Repper gently but persistently tried to break through Pam's conditioned responses. Pam by now clearly knew the investigators suspected her husband of murder. She maintained her story for most of the interview, but under mounting pressure and likely feeling the weight of evidence against Ryan, Pam finally cracked just a little. She admitted that their original alibi was false. They had not been out all night doing laundry as she'd claimed for years. In fact, she said, they were home by 8 p.m. on that Saturday night. According to this adjusted timeline, after doing one load of laundry early in the evening, they returned to Ryan's apartment. Then, Pam claimed, Ryan left the apartment later that night for a while and came back very late. Specifically, she said he was gone for a long stretch in the middle of the night and she didn't know where he went. He returned around 4 or 5 a.m. briefly, saying he'd been out dealing drugs to make some extra money, which she didn't question at the time, then left again and didn't come home for good until 9 a.m. Sunday morning. Pam stuck to the part that she didn't know what he was doing during those hours. She implied she thought he was out partying or drug dealing back then. She admitted that Ryan had coached her to lie about being together all night because he was afraid any illegal activity, like dealing marijuana, would make him look bad in a murder investigation. This was a huge shift. Pam had essentially placed Ryan out of the house, unaccounted for, during the exact time frame the murders occurred, sometime likely around midnight to 1 a.m. However, she still didn't confess knowledge of the murders themselves. It was progress, but she was holding something back. Detective Repper could sense it. Likely, Pam was still terrified of what would happen if she told the full truth, and indeed, her partial admission sent Ryan into a tailspin. Partway through Pam's interview, Ryan, sitting in another room, realized something was wrong. He started banging on the one-way glass window, yelling to be let in, demanding to know what Pam was saying. The detectives had heard enough. They stopped the interview and allowed Ryan and Pam to leave, not wanting to push Pam too far too fast. But it was clear that the cracks were forming in the dam of secrecy that had held for 25 years. Ryan was livid. Over the next days, he left over 30 voicemails on Detective Dave Blakely's phone. The messages were a roller coaster of emotions. In some, Ryan was furious, hurling insults at the detectives for harassing Pam and bullying her into changing her story. In others, he sounded panicked, pleading, almost ingratiating, calling them sons of bitches but a necessary evil, oddly acknowledging they were just doing their jobs. He denied over and over any involvement in his sister's death, claiming the detectives were feeding lies to his wife and digging up childhood indiscretions that had nothing to do with anything. The more he talked, the worse it got for him. Ryan was unraveling. To Blakely and Repper, the voicemails were practically a confession by nervous breakdown. They knew they were close. By January 2013, the cold case detectives decided it was time for a final push. They believed Pam wanted to tell the truth but was afraid. They also worried that with Ryan's escalating erratic behavior, Pam might be in danger if he suspected she was cooperating. So one day they caught up with Pam at her workplace, unannounced, to get her away from Ryan's watchful eye. They gently urged her. This was it. They were not going away. They knew she had more to tell, and for her own sake and her children's, it was time to come clean. Perhaps seeing no other escape from the burden she'd carried so long, Pam agreed to a full formal interview at the station on her own terms. On January 18, 2013, Pamela Wingarden Marachini sat down with detectives Blakely and Repper and unburdened herself of a secret she had held for a quarter of a century. She made sure to preface her statement on record. She was there voluntarily. She was not being threatened or coerced by police, and she understood the gravity of what she was about to say. Then, at last, she began to speak the truth. Pam recounted that on the night of November 21st, 1987, Ryan had indeed left their apartment late, after they'd returned from doing laundry. When he first left, she assumed he was off doing something minor and would be back soon. But hours passed. In the early morning hours of Sunday, November 22nd, Ryan returned to the apartment in a frantic state, banging on the door around 9 a.m. Pam opened it to find Ryan in tears, shaking and extremely upset. The words tumbled out of him. "I killed Gail and Rick." Pam was thunderstruck, absolutely horrified. She didn't want to believe it, but Ryan was babbling details. He told her he had driven out to Gail and Rick's house after leaving their apartment. He confronted them about the family disputes, the argument over parking the parents' camper on their land, and the money he owed Gail for the car loan. The argument got heated, and Rick had basically kicked Ryan out, telling him to leave and never come back if he was going to be disrespectful. Enraged and humiliated, Ryan stormed off, but only down the road. 20 minutes later, seething with anger and adrenaline, Ryan decided on a ruse to get Rick to lower his guard. He returned to the Brink house, knocked, and when Rick came out, Ryan claimed his car wouldn't start and he needed help with a jump. Rick, being the helpful guy he was, and perhaps not wanting to hold a grudge, agreed to assist. Rick walked with Ryan out to the driveway and went to open the hood of his Blazer to get the jumper cables. At that moment, Ryan pulled out a .22 caliber revolver he had brought with him. As Rick stood by the driver's side of the Blazer, Ryan walked up and fired 2 shots directly into the left side of Rick's head at point-blank range. Rick dropped to the ground, or into the truck. Accounts differ slightly. He likely died instantly, or was incapacitated without even realizing what happened. Ryan then went into the house, where Gail had gone back to their bedroom, perhaps getting ready for bed or lying down. The noise might have alerted her slightly, but she was in her nightclothes and likely half asleep. Ryan entered the bedroom, pillow in hand, and approached his little sister. One can only imagine the terror and confusion Gail felt in her final moments, woken by her brother looming over her with a gun. Ryan pressed the pillow over Gail's face, a grotesque parody of a caring gesture, then fired 3 bullets through it into her head. Gail died there in her bed. Ryan later claimed to Pam that his motive was that Gail thought she was too good for the family now, that she had turned her back on them. But underlying that, as Pam learned, was his jealousy and fear regarding the incest secret. Pam was in shock hearing this confession. She didn't scream or run. She was frozen. Ryan was her boyfriend, the father of her infant son. Their baby was about 6 months old at the time. Now he was a confessed murderer, sobbing in front of her. As Pam described it, she did not want to believe what he said. But before she could even process it, Ryan insisted on showing her proof, or rather binding her into his secret by making her face it. That same afternoon, Sunday, Ryan begged Pam to come with him, saying he needed her. Against her better judgment, she agreed to get in the car with him, bringing along her baby boy, maybe out of fear of leaving the child alone with him otherwise. But instead of driving her to his apartment or someplace to calm down, Ryan drove straight to the Brink house on Ransom Street. When they arrived, it was eerily quiet. At this point, no one had yet discovered the bodies, so the house was just sitting there with its terrible secrets inside. Ryan led Pam first to Rick's Blazer in the driveway. He forced her to look inside at Rick's lifeless body, slumped over just as Gail Brink would later find him. Pam broke down in tears at the sight, but Ryan's twisted mission wasn't over. He then grabbed Pam by the wrist and dragged her towards the house. They entered. Ryan likely still had the front door key, since it was his former house too when he lived with his parents, a detail that explained the lack of forced entry. He took Pam into the bedroom, where Gail's bloodied body lay sprawled on the bed, the pillow still over her ruined face. Pam was hysterical, but Ryan held her firm, making her witness the horror he had created. Pam's voice trembled as she described to detectives how she saw her friend, for Gail was also her friend, not just Ryan's sister, brutally killed on the bed. Ryan's demeanor was bizarrely calm now, almost proud. "Isn't she so beautiful?" he said of his sister, gazing at the corpse. It was a ghastly, surreal moment. On the drive back home, Ryan issued a clear and terrifying threat to Pam. "If you ever tell anyone, I will do the same to you and your family." Pam believed him absolutely. She had just seen firsthand what he was capable of. She was trapped. In fear and shock, she did what he said. Back at his apartment, Ryan went about trying to eliminate evidence. He showed her the gun he had used, a .22 revolver, and a bag containing the clothes he had worn during the murders, likely blood-splattered. Pam watched as Ryan stashed these items in the trunk of his car, saying he'd dispose of them soon. Later, investigators would suspect he buried or dumped them somewhere far away. Indeed, those items were never recovered. Then Ryan got down to business constructing a bulletproof story. He sat Pam down and meticulously coached her on the fake alibi. They would say they spent all Saturday night doing laundry and then went home, period. He drilled it into her, repeated it over and over, making sure she could recite it flawlessly. If she deviated, he warned, they'd both be in trouble. He even implied that because she now knew of the crime, she was an accessory after the fact. Pam was just 21 years old with a baby and an abusive, manipulative partner. She felt she had no choice but to comply. For 25 years, Pam lived under the weight of that lie and the terror of Ryan's threat. She married him months later, perhaps seeing no way out and hoping maybe with marriage and time he'd settle. They went on to have more children, but life with Ryan was a continuation of the nightmare. He isolated her from friends and family, always afraid perhaps that she'd slip up and tell someone. He reminded her often of what he'd done, and the threat lingered. If she ever betrayed him, he could kill her just as easily. Pam confessed to detectives that for years she did still love Ryan on some level. After all, he was the father of her kids and could be charming when he wasn't enraged. But she also lived in constant fear. She felt complicit, dirty with the secret, and also genuinely afraid that if she went to police, she might go to jail too for not coming forward sooner. Ryan had manipulated her into believing that revealing the truth would only destroy their family and land her in legal jeopardy. So she kept quiet until she couldn't any longer. As Pam finished her confession, the weight of decades seemed to lift from her shoulders. Detectives asked the pressing question, "Why come forward now?" Pam said she had reached a breaking point. Their kids were older. She was tired of the lies and the guilt. She also mentioned that after the detectives first contacted them in 2011, she felt physically ill from stress and couldn't keep living like that. She realized Ryan would never let her go or let her be truthful unless he was caught. So when Blakely and Repper promised they'd be with her every step of the way, she finally believed it was possible to be free of Ryan's hold. With the full confession in hand, the cold case team knew it was time to act. Ryan's behavior had become increasingly erratic and dangerous. Just during the time Pam was in this final interview, her cell phone rang constantly with calls and buzzing with text messages. In the span of a couple hours, Ryan tried to contact her over 100 times. He clearly sensed something was happening and was desperately trying to reassert control. The detectives weren't about to let Pam walk out and go home to that potential fury. Nor could they let Ryan have a chance to flee or destroy any remaining evidence. They had what they needed: probable cause to arrest Ryan Wingarden for the murders of Gail and Rick Brink. Within hours on that same day, January 18, 2013, police located and arrested 50-year-old Ryan Mark Wingarden. He did not get a chance to confront Pam. She was kept safely away. During Ryan's interrogation, he denied everything, predictably. He clung to the laundry alibi, even after being told Pam had spilled the truth. He claimed the detectives were lying about Pam's statements, or that Pam herself was lying for reasons he couldn't fathom. When pressed about the sexual abuse of Gail, he again minimized it. He admitted only to a single inappropriate encounter, trying to paint it as a mutual, childish experiment. He maintained that he had nothing to do with his sister and brother-in-law's deaths. But at that point, his protestations fell on deaf ears. The case was no longer cold, it was burning hot. The man who had evaded justice for 26 years was finally in custody. While in jail awaiting trial, Ryan couldn't resist trying to continue his manipulation. Despite a no-contact order, he managed to send 29 letters to Pam from behind bars. In these letters, he oscillated wildly between pleading and threatening. One day he would beg her to take back the lies and promise that they could still have a life together. The next, he would angrily accuse her of betrayal and rail against the investigators. He insisted the detectives coerced her and brainwashed her into believing he was guilty. He even suggested he might sue the police for misconduct. Pam turned all these letters over to law enforcement. They would later serve as additional evidence of his consciousness of guilt and witness tampering attempts. The small community of Holland was stunned as news broke in early 2013 that an arrest had finally been made in the infamous Brink cold case, and even more shocked to learn the suspect was Gail's own brother. Many who remembered the grieving brother from 1987 couldn't fathom that he could have harbored such a dark secret all these years. For Gail's family, it was a bittersweet development. On one hand, they were relieved that answers were finally coming. On the other, it meant accepting that their son-brother had allegedly committed the unthinkable. The trial. Justice, delayed but delivered. In March 2014, the case of the people of Michigan vs. Ryan Wingarden went to trial in the Ottawa County Courthouse. It had been 26.5 years since the murders. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, curious locals, and of course members of the Brink and Wingarden families. The trial garnered significant media attention across Michigan. It's not every day that a case this old, involving incest and a brother killing a sister, comes to light. The prosecution team was led by Ottawa County Prosecutor Ronald France, with Assistant Prosecutor Lee Fisher. Note, competitor text mentioned names like Laura Mitchell and Jacob Flynn, but actual records indicate Ronald France was the prosecutor at trial. They laid out their narrative of the crime in stark terms. In opening statements, Prosecutor France told the jury, "This is a case about jealousy, rage, and dark family secrets." He outlined a triple motive for Ryan: jealousy and resentment of Gail's happy life with Rick. The newlyweds had a stability and success that Ryan envied. Anger over the family dispute, Gail's refusal to let their parents park on her property, and the tension over money had infuriated Ryan that very day. Fear and self-preservation, the driving motive that Gail might reveal the incestuous abuse to Rick, which could destroy Ryan's world. He described how all these factors simmered in Ryan until, in the early hours of November 22, 1987, they exploded into violence. To prove their case, the prosecution had more than 60 witnesses lined up. Over 3 weeks of testimony, a very detailed picture was presented to the jury. Pamela Wingarden was, without doubt, the star witness. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. This was the moment the whole case hinged on, her credibility versus his. Pam spoke in a soft, timid voice. At first, she needed some gentle prompting from the prosecutor to speak up so everyone could hear. She recounted her story, the same she had told the detectives in painstaking detail: the false alibi, Ryan's tearful confession to her, the horrifying tour of the crime scene he forced upon her, the threats and the decades of living in fear. As she described seeing Rick's body in the truck and Gail's body on the bed, many jurors and audience members had tears in their eyes. It was gut-wrenching. Pam also revealed her inner turmoil. She admitted that part of her remained with Ryan all those years out of a kind of love or trauma bond, but she ultimately found the courage to protect herself and her children by coming forward. Throughout her testimony, Ryan sat at the defense table glaring daggers at her. At one point, as Pam described the events, Ryan lost his composure. He suddenly stood up and shouted, "Lies! She's a black-hearted liar!" or words to that effect, accusing her of making it all up. The outburst was so intense that sheriff's deputies had to intervene and physically escort Ryan out of the courtroom until he could compose himself. The judge admonished him and warned the defense team to control their client. Pam was shaken by the eruption, but she continued on, tears streaming at times, determined to finally let the truth out. The prosecution had Cheryl Murphy, Wingarden, testify as well. Cheryl corroborated Ryan's strange statements at the funeral. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have done it," and his detailed hypothetical description of the crime scene that struck her as odd. She also spoke of how she'd trusted Ryan for years, and how betrayed and devastated she felt to learn of his abuse of Gail and his role in her death. Aunt Neva took the stand, confirming how both Gail and Ryan had called her on the day of the murder, complaining about the camper and money, and recounting Ryan's chilling statement at the funeral, blaming Gail's actions for her own murder, and him asking if she thought he was capable of it. Lynn, their other sister, testified about Ryan's disturbing comment that he felt he raped Gail and wanted to apologize, further driving home that an incestuous assault had occurred, in Ryan's own admission. Crystal, Chris Bann, testified to the confession Ryan made to her in the park about having a sexual relationship with Gail, and how he leered at Gail's bikini photo and said he lusted after her that day on the boat. Chris's testimony was critical in establishing Ryan's motive and obsession. Independent of Pam's statements, the prosecution also called to the stand James Jim Bove, a friend of Ryan's. Competitor mentioned a friend named Jimbo who came over for coffee right after the murders. Jim testified that he had visited Ryan's apartment for coffee on Sunday, November 22, 1987, sometime in the afternoon. During that visit, Ryan had mentioned to him that something terrible happened to Gail and Rick, implying he'd heard they were killed, even though officially their bodies weren't found until the next day, Monday. This indicated Ryan knew about the murders before a normal person would have, an incriminating detail. Jim also recalled Ryan being strangely calm, even making offhand remarks about the crime, as if he had insider knowledge. Perhaps most dramatic was the testimony of a jailhouse informant, Darrell Kane, name from competitor's text. Darrell shared a cell block with Ryan after Ryan's arrest. He recounted to the jury how Ryan had boasted about getting away with it for so long, and that if he'd known his wife would betray him, he would have killed her a long time ago. According to Darrell, Ryan even mimed choking someone when talking about Pam. This chilling statement underscored the threat Pam had lived under and further implicated Ryan by showing he effectively admitted to Darrell that he did commit the murders. The medical examiner and forensic experts testified about the wounds, confirming that Rick was shot twice in the head, Gail 3 times in the face, consistent with a .22 caliber firearm. Ballistic experts explained how the bullet trajectory through the Blazer's window matched being shot from outside with the window down. Supporting the scenario, Rick rolled down his window to talk to someone he knew. An employee from Gail's workplace, the automotive office, was called to refute the defense's later claim about a missing document. This official testified that there was no secret financial document involving Gail that would have led to murder, effectively labeling the defense's theory as baseless. All of this built a compelling narrative that pointed squarely at Ryan Wingarden as the only person with motive, opportunity, and a pattern of incriminating behavior. The defense, of course, tried to counter this tidal wave of evidence. Ryan's defense attorneys, one was named Richard Helton or Halpin, and co-counsel Diana, based on competitor text, but we'll generalize as the defense team, faced an uphill battle. In their opening statement, they reminded the jury that there was no physical evidence linking Ryan to the scene, no DNA, no fingerprints positively identified as his, no murder weapon found. They argued that the case was entirely circumstantial and hinged on the word of a woman, Pam, who they painted as a coerced or vengeful wife. They suggested Pam had reasons to lie. Maybe she wanted out of the marriage or had been brainwashed by intense interrogation. The defense floated several alternative theories, however far-fetched, to plant reasonable doubt. The mysterious fingerprints. They emphasized those 2 unidentified fingerprints found back in 1987, one on the phone, one on the toilet. That did not match Ryan or the victims. Who did those belong to? The defense attorney asked the jury pointedly. The prosecution can't tell you. Isn't it possible they belong to the real killer? It was a thin point, since prints on a phone or toilet could have innocuous origins, repairmen, friends, etc. But it was one tangible thing they could harp on, something at the scene not tied to Ryan. Crime scene reconstruction. Doubts. The defense brought in a so-called forensic expert who speculated that the hole in Rick's truck window might not have been from a bullet at all, but could have been made by a crowbar or some other tool during a struggle. This, contradicting the prosecution's ballistic evidence, was an attempt to muddy the clarity of the narrative. If Rick's window was broken differently, maybe the scenario wasn't as the state said. However, under cross-examination, this theory didn't hold up well, as the prosecution's expert had clearly identified bullet trajectories and even recovered a slug from the vehicle's interior, matching Gail's wounds, etc. Workplace motive theory. In perhaps the most head-scratching twist, the defense suggested that the murders might have been related to something at Gail's job. They insinuated without evidence that Gail had discovered some financial irregularity or important document at the automotive office where she worked, and that someone she worked with might have wanted to silence her and retrieve that document from the house. This was a desperate attempt to conjure an unknown killer scenario. When pressed for details, the defense could provide none. They asked a detective on cross if a certain piece of paper was found in a wastebasket at the Brink home, implying maybe a document was taken. It was all extremely speculative. The prosecution, in rebuttal, had Gail's supervisor testify that no such document existed and nothing from work was missing. Recycled biker hit theory. In a last-ditch effort, the defense team even revisited the old biker gang Shotgun Sid story. They reminded jurors that back in 1987, investigators themselves looked into the possibility of an outsider gang hit. Isn't it possible, the defense suggested, that those early instincts were right? Perhaps the wrong people were targeted, and the killer has been out there all this time unrelated to the family. Again, there was zero evidence to support this in present day, and it contradicted Ryan's own incriminating actions. The prosecutor, in closing arguments, scoffed at these defense theories, calling them smoke and mirrors and little green men from Mars stories, basically saying the defense wants you to chase imaginary scenarios that have no basis in reality. After the presentation of all evidence and spirited closing arguments from both sides, the case went to the jury. It didn't take long. On March 28, 2014, after only about 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Ryan Wingarden, at age 51, was convicted of murdering his sister Gail and brother-in-law Rick. In the courtroom, a collective gasp and then sobs broke the silence as the verdict was read. Gail's siblings, including Cheryl and Lynn, embraced each other, tears of relief and sorrow flowing. Rick's family members quietly nodded, some weeping. Justice, long delayed, was finally here. Ryan Wingarden, however, showed little reaction at that moment beyond a clenched jaw. Perhaps he was in shock, or perhaps still in denial. At the sentencing hearing a few weeks later in April 2014, emotions ran even higher. In Michigan, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, so the sentence itself was a foregone conclusion. But the hearing allowed family members to give victim impact statements and Ryan to speak if he wished, before the judge pronounced the sentence formally. Ryan Wingarden could not contain himself when given the chance to speak. What followed was an extraordinary, rambling, hour-long rant in which Ryan portrayed himself as the true victim. He maintained his innocence with fervor, accusing basically everyone else of lying or conspiring against him. He called his sister Cheryl and his wife Pam liars. He accused the detectives of manipulating his family. He went so far as to call Judge John Hulsing, the presiding judge, unjust, and even a liar at one point. Ryan's tirade included the outrageous line, "They mentally raped my wife into this," claiming that the investigators coerced Pam's testimony by basically brainwashing her, using the very language of sexual violence that he himself had perpetrated, which was not lost on anyone. The more Ryan raved, the more the courtroom saw exactly the kind of person he was, controlling, abusive, and utterly incapable of remorse. Judge Hulsing eventually had to interject. The judge sternly warned Ryan that if he didn't stop the outbursts and insults, he would be bound and gagged for the remainder of the hearing. At one point, Judge Hulsing threatened, "I will have the deputies duct tape your mouth if that's what it takes, sir." Even this didn't fully shut Ryan up. He still muttered and tried to talk over others, until finally the judge ordered him to remain silent. In delivering the sentence, Judge Hulsing said, "This was a brutal homicide. You, sir, are a brutal, cold-blooded murderer." He then formally sentenced Ryan Wingarden to 2 life terms without parole, one for Gail's murder and one for Rick's, to be served consecutively. Not that it matters, since life means life. Before court adjourned, family members gave their statements. Rick's brother, Bud Brink, spoke on behalf of the Brink family. He recalled the words spoken at Rick and Gail's funeral so many years ago by their priest, "This is not the work of the Lord, this is the work of the devil." Bud looked directly at Ryan and said, "You, Ryan, carried out the work of the devil when you executed my brother and sister-in-law out of jealousy and anger." He talked about how the murders stole not only 2 lives, but also forever darkened every holiday and family gathering. The holidays, the special times we used to share as a family, have been wiped away by your actions, he lamented. Bud expressed forgiveness might come in time, but that was in God's hands. Today was about justice. Cheryl Murphy, Wingarden, then addressed the court. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke about her sister Gail, how vibrant, loving and hard-working Gail was, and how brutally her life was taken. Cheryl said for 27 years she had lived with a cloud of guilt and grief, not knowing who killed her sister and Rick. She directly thanked the cold case detectives and the prosecution team for not giving up. Looking at her brother, she said quietly but firmly, "My sister's been gone for 27 years. Now I can finally go to her grave and say goodbye and tell her we're done. We finally got him. Gail and Rick, you can rest in peace now." Many in the courtroom were openly weeping at her statement. Ryan's mother, Dorothy Wingarden, was perhaps the only dissenting voice. Even after hearing all the evidence, she refused to believe her son was guilty. In the hallway after sentencing, and as noted by one officer in court, Dorothy said, "I don't care what they say. They're wrong." It was heartbreaking as she had effectively lost 2 children in this ordeal, one to murder and one to prison, but she could not accept that her son had done this. With that, the legal saga closed. Ryan Wingarden was led away in handcuffs, officially a convicted murderer heading to prison for the rest of his natural life. In the following years, he did pursue appeals. His attorneys appealed the conviction on various technical grounds. They argued that the evidence was insufficient, that the time gap prejudiced the case, that some testimony, like the jailhouse informants, or details of prior bad acts like incest, should have been excluded, etc. The Michigan Court of Appeals reviewed and upheld the conviction, finding no reversible errors. The Michigan Supreme Court declined to hear the case, effectively exhausting his state appeals by 2016. Every higher court agreed that the jury had ample evidence to find Ryan guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. How community changed, a measure of closure. The unraveling of the Brink murder mystery brought a mix of relief and sorrow to Holland, Michigan. In one sense, people finally got the answer to a question that had lingered in local law for decades. Who killed that young couple back in 1987? The answer turned out to be more unsettling than any of the rumors that had floated around. It wasn't a random drifter, or a secret biker assassin, or a serial killer stalking the streets. It was someone from within the very family, someone who attended the same church potlucks and holiday dinners. Proof that evil can hide in plain sight, wearing the face of a loved one. Ottawa County in 2014 was not the same place it was in 1987. The innocence of that earlier time had been chipped away, and the Brink case was one of the blows that did it. Many residents could still recall the fear that took hold after the murders, how neighbors started locking doors religiously, and how trust was replaced with wariness. Local historian Martha Jones noted in an interview that the case took away a piece of our small town's soul. It forced us to confront the fact that terrible secrets and terrible crimes can be lurking behind the most ordinary front doors. Even after the case was solved, that lesson remained. People are perhaps a bit more cautious, a bit more attuned to the idea that not everything is as wholesome as it appears. For the families directly involved, there was a measure of closure at last. Cheryl publicly expressed her gratitude that justice had been done, emphasizing that while nothing would bring Gail and Rick back, at least now they knew what happened and why. Rick Brink's family echoed that sentiment. His brother Bud, David, said they were extremely pleased to have the justice my brother deserves. At least, this gives us some answers about how and why it happened, which is something we've waited a long time for. They could finally begin to heal without the gnawing uncertainty. Pam Wingarden, in the aftermath, filed for divorce from Ryan. She had already emotionally separated from him by coming forward, but now she was legally cutting ties and building a new life, free from his shadow at last. Many saw her as a tragic figure who found redemption, a victim who summoned heroic courage to do the right thing despite great personal risk. The Ottawa County Cold Case Unit earned national recognition for solving this case. Detectives David Blakely and Venus Repper demonstrated how dogged re-investigation, combined with modern understanding of psychology, like how abusers manipulate victims, and forensic re-examination, could crack even the most perplexing cold cases. Their success became a model for other jurisdictions, showing that cases shouldn't be considered hopeless just because time has passed. People change, relationships change, and sometimes that's the key to finally getting the truth. As for Ryan Wingarden, now inmate something in a Michigan prison, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. In one of his appeals, he still protested his innocence, but to this day, he's never taken responsibility or shown genuine remorse for what he did. He sits in a cell, aging, with nothing but time to think about how his sick desires and anger destroyed not only his sister's life and Rick's life, but also shattered his own family. Gail and Rick Brink should have grown old together, raised children, and lived out their dreams on that beautiful piece of land on Ransom Street. That future was stolen from them in an act of unspeakable betrayal. Yet, in their deaths, years later, they brought to light truths that likely saved others, Pam and her children, from further harm. Their story is now told as a cautionary tale about the evil that can fester behind closed doors and the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of justice. The file on the Brink double murder, once relegated to a dusty box, is now closed, its final chapter written by a jury's verdict and a judge's sentence. In Holland, the memory of Gail and Rick lives on, not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as reminders of the resilience of a community and the enduring love of family and friends who refuse to let their story be forgotten. Thank you for being here and listening to this long but important story. If you found this video compelling, please subscribe to Crime Unknown and tap the notification bell so you don't miss any future true crime documentaries we share. Your support enables us to keep honoring these victims' stories. Stay safe, everyone, and take care of your loved ones. Hug them a little tighter tonight in memory of Gail and Rick Brink, a young couple whose lives were cut short, but for whom justice was finally served, even after 27 years.